I don't feel threatened. You make a good case why I should. I'm not scared of Amazon or Facebook because, yes, they want to manipulate me, but I'm a little scared of the algorithm and how it might divide America by feeding us more of what we believe and push us apart more. But basically, they want my money, and to get my money in a free market, a company has to give me what I want, and that's a good thing.
Even if we look at this from the most libertarian perspective, when we talk about the free market operating, we are presuming that there is open competition. We are presuming that there is fair competition. We do not live in a perfect world. We do not have the benefit of a perfect market. There are monopolies that exist. There are companies that exploit flaws in regulations and the moats that have been granted to them. And it's hard to find a better example of this than a lot of the internet giants as they exist today. And so I think it's fair to recognize that even though, free market, even though we have consumer choice, even though we can do other things, that only is true where there is an alternative, where there is a reasonable competitor that can provide the same service, or that it's even possible to launch a competitor to these things. And I don't believe this is true in that larger sense. But as you say, so you were saying, if I heard it correctly, that you're not super afraid of these things in the specific sense. You understand in the general sense. You have these fears, but what can you do to protect yourself? This is always a question that I get, and it's very difficult to answer because the advice changes year to year. Because technology is dynamic. The devices are changing, the protocols are changing, the services are changing, the platforms are changing, the laws are changing. And so I don't like to give specific advice because it dates very quickly, and this video will live forever with all of the rest of the things on our permanent record. What I will tell you is there are organizations out there that are dedicated to creating these kind of guides for how to protect yourself and keeping them up to date. You can search for sites like privacy tools, like surveillance self-defense guides from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. The American Civil Liberties Union creates guides. The Freedom of the Press Foundation, which I'm the president of, creates a guide for working journalists. But largely, the most important thing to protect yourself is to recognize you are not going to win an arms race against the richest companies in history and the most powerful states that the world has ever seen. The surveillance problem, first and foremost, is a political problem because it is enabled by a political class that does not share our burdens, it does not share our struggles, and it exempts itself from this gaze. It is not held to the same standard of behavior, the same level of accountability as you and I. And this system, this knowledge, this influence will increasingly be used to shape our lives while excusing them from these same methods of control. So political action, I think, and concern is actually the root of resolving this and recognizing what are the ways that this can be changed. What is the single point of failure that all of these exploitative practices are relying on that allows this system as it is to come into being? And we talked before about these silos, the Google stash, the Facebook stash, everybody's private records that are reigning in there and being used in different ways. And the government can sort of open the lids to the different, salt shakers and help themselves. Well, how did those silos get filled? We have in the United States, as I said, no basic privacy law. The Fourth Amendment binds the federal government and the state government, but it does not restrain these companies that are basically acting in willful conspiracy with regulators, where each hand washes the other in a sort of monopoly position. There is, I believe, a common failure in the laws as they are interpreted by the courts of the United States today. In a 1970s era case, This sounds random, but I promise it comes together very quickly, called Smith versus Maryland. And it led to the birth of what is called the third-party doctrine. If you look back in American history into what law enforcement could get through investigations, they were strictly limited to two categories of gains. They were called the fruits and instrumentalities of a crime. If they were chasing a burglar, they could get a warrant. The warrant would allow them to go in the house, go in the business, whatever. They could get the bag of loot, the fruits that they won. They could take the crowbar, the mask, the gloves, the instrumentalities of the crime, and they could use this as evidence to convict. They could not go to that burglar's landlord and, get records of payment. They could not go to the phone company and seize the phone company's records because they were neither fruits nor instrumentalities. This new world where the government can demand private entities, private records about customers, or even your own records about yourself, your diaries or whatever, is a very, very new thing. It's about 60 years old, right? And in this Smith versus Maryland case in the 1970s, the government interpreted one case of the cops investigating a basically man making harassing phone calls to a woman, where this was an individual who was suspected of wrongdoing. The cops went to the phone company and said, can we get his phone records to see if he called this house, because the woman saw his license plate as he drove by, sort of leering at her house, and thought it was him. And the cops agreed. Phone company turned it over, and sure enough, it was him. They caught the guy making the harassing phone calls. It seems fair. But they did it without a warrant. And when this went all the way up to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court knew he was a bad guy, knew he did a bad thing, they didn't want to let him walk. And so they tried to create a paradigm in which they could go. The phone company could do this. They could give this person's records of what they were doing over to the cops without a warrant. And this was called the third-party doctrine. The government said that because these records did not belong to the man, even though there were records about him, they belonged to the company because the company created him. That man had no privacy interest in those records. Therefore, he had no Fourth Amendment protections regarding those records. Well, in the decades since the 1970s, when the court could not have imagined the world that we live in today, that our movements can be tracked by our phones, that companies have records of everything about us, the government has repeatedly leaned on this one single outdated court opinion of one guy making scary phone calls to go, no one in the country, no one in the world has a privacy interest in any records that are created about them, but held by a third party. If that changes, this surveillance ends.
Ends? Really? People won't find a way to get around it?
I think legally, if you recognize that people have a property interest or a privacy interest in information about them, that means it's no longer the company's records, they're your records. And so you now are in the driver's seat. Yes, Amazon could create a record about you with your consent, but you control it. You can revoke it. You can destroy it. And this is what has changed. Right now, we have a non-consensual relationship. It is premised on the illusion of consent, the idea that, you clicked OK to continue. But that doesn't work in any other contract law sense. You can't click OK to bind yourself into servitude for the rest of your life. You can't click OK to be victimized repeatedly anywhere else except the internet. And I think as soon as we recognize that this is not proper and is not appropriate, life will be better for all of us, because we will have more control over our own destinies and over our own stories.